Today is Saturday. So, as part of the ongoing ceasefire deal, Hamas was expected to release three Israeli captives, and in return, Israel had to release 183 Palestinian hostages, most of whom were held in Israeli concentration camps for years under inhumane conditions. As expected, our beloved BBC, funded by British taxpayers, including millions of those who have condemned Israel for its war crimes in the last 15 months and 76 years, swung into action to act as an Israeli cheerleader. But if you watched more than 6 hours of non-stop coverage on the BBC on today's exchange of Palestinian hostages with three Israeli captives, you can't be blamed for mistaking BBC's coverage as that of Israeli Broadcasting Corporation. The presenter was Samantha Simmonds. This will put today's pro-Israeli coverage in proper perspective. That's because this woman has faced constant condemnation for her perceived pro-Israeli biases, even when Israel brutally murdered more than 61,000 Palestinians, with 70% of them being women and children. But not once did this Samantha woman use murder to describe Israeli atrocities. You would argue that the BBC's editorial guidelines don't permit her to use that word. Fair enough, but wrong. She repeatedly used that term to describe what happened on 7th of October 2023.
He was taken from Kibbutz Be'eri with his brother Yossi, who has been killed since then. His British-born wife Leanne and their two daughters, Noya and Yael, were murdered in those attacks. We've heard from Ellie's family that they don't know if he knows that he is returning home to Israel, but his wife and two daughters were murdered that day on October the 7th.
She then kept expressing her concerns for the well-being of Israeli captives being released by Hamas. Words she used were thin, emaciated, etc., etc. At no point did she feel it right to explain that it was Israel's genocidal campaign of more than 15 months that caused famine-like situation for the whole of Gaza. She didn't care to explain why Israel had caused 15 months of blockade, where no food, medicine, or water was allowed to enter Gaza. In contrast, when the BBC showed the footage of Palestinian hostages being released from Israeli concentration camps, we saw a severely ill man holding his oxygen cylinder as he was carried by others out of the bus. But Samantha had a problem even here. Unlike her concern for Israelis, she was seen mourning here, stating how these visuals would be causing discomfort among Israelis.
There's one prisoner who's being released who I believe is serving multiple life sentences just for that.
Yeah, so joyous scenes for many in the West Bank and Gaza, and as we were saying, difficult ones for many in Israel who see the release of, in some cases, people who've killed their loved ones, and it has caused tension and difficulties within Israel.
She even used the word concentration camp, but not for Palestinian victims of Israeli torture, but three Israeli captives being released today. Once again, she didn't care to balance it by making it clear that Hamas would deny this allegation, the way she is always so quick to tell us how Israelis would feel and what they would say.
On Pete Brisley, who's the father-in-law of Eli Sharabi, who lives in Wales and was watching these images of his son-in-law being released, but suffering the trauma of the fact that his daughter Leanne and his grandchildren Noya and Yael were murdered on October the 7th. This is Ellie's wife and children, and he said in a statement to the BBC, it's very emotional here, it's great to see him released, but I wasn't expecting to see him looking like that, so very thin and emaciated. He said he looks like he's just come out of a concentration camp.
While interviewing a guest from Egypt, she asked him if his country should take Palestinians as part of Donald Trump's ethnic cleansing plan. And the guy had just said that Gaza will be rebuilt by Palestinians, and this Samantha woman made a fierce intervention by repeating Trump's arguments. If you weren't watching the BBC, you would have thought she was the press secretary of the White House.
Let me ask you about what Mr. Trump has said this week, this idea of the US taking a long-term ownership position of Gaza. The US said they're prepared to look at all options, and they want the Palestinian people, more than 2 million people, to relocate into Egypt, into Jordan, while the US rebuilds Gaza. The plans aren't clear yet. That's roughly what's being talked about. Do you think Egypt would be prepared to take large numbers of Palestinian people while Gaza is rebuilt? Is that a viable option?
First of all, madam, the people who would rebuild Gaza are the Palestinians themselves. This is the first thing.
Is that possible when so much of the territory has been decimated? Is it possible to rebuild this, 26-mile-long territory while people are still living in it, when there is so much to clear and there are so many dangerous ammunitions and other materials around?
This reminded me of a similar broadcast from Fox News, when their presenters said exactly the same thing to a Canadian guest in justification of Trump's threats to illegally annex Canada into the US.
I get it. You say that Americans don't have a problem with Canadians, and we don't. But it seems like you have a problem with us. Because if I were a citizen of another country and I was a neighbor of the United States, I would consider it a privilege to be taken over by the United States of America. That's what everybody else in the world wants. American citizenship. For some reason, that's repellent to you Canadians. And I find that personally offensive, Premier.
By the way, BBC presenter Samantha, as you know, I do not call these people journalists, also told her Egyptian guest that Israel had ended its occupation of Gaza in 2007. This despite the fact that the world's topmost court, the International Court of Justice, only last year ruled that Israel had continued to illegally occupy not just Gaza, but the occupied West Bank and other Palestinian territories. She also told her Egyptian guest that Hamas was designated a terrorist organization around the world. Once again, a clear mischief. If you consider the EU as one country bloc, only 9 countries around the world have declared Hamas a terrorist organization. They are the US, no prize for guessing, its friend the UK, Israel, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Japan, and the Channel Islands. There are more than 200 countries in the world. You wonder why she didn't state this fact instead of making a sweeping around the world comment.
Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organization around the world, so they would say that they have tried that option.
Just because she didn't get a pushback from her Egyptian guest, she tried this trick again with her next guest, Palestinian lawmaker Mustafa Barghouti. Oh, by the way, she also kept highlighting how many of those Palestinians being released today were involved in deadly crimes. Said who? Israel's kangaroo courts? The Palestinian guest was in no mood to accept this and decided to call out her biases.
When he advocated in his speech 2 war crimes, the war crime of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people of Gaza and the war crime of theft, of stealing somebody else's land, the Palestinian people's land in Gaza, which he wants to use for his reconstruction after ethnic cleansing. Yeah. I think these are very dangerous statements. They should be utterly rejected by everybody because Palestinians have the right to be on their land and have the right to live in peace, a just peace, like Israelis.
Yeah, and as we know, of the 183 prisoners who are being released today, 18 are serving life sentences for deadly attacks on Israelis. When it comes to expectations, though, around Hamas, I was speaking to Dan Meridor, who's a former Israeli deputy prime minister, and he said when it comes to peace, Hamas has shown no attempt to deny its history of wanting to eradicate Israel and referred back to the deadly attacks of October the 7th, in which more than 1,200 Israelis were killed. So what are your expectations for Hamas? It's clear what you want from Israel, but in terms of where they need to shift, what their possible negotiating areas could be, what do you want from them?
Well, Samantha, you're being unfortunately unbalanced again when you say deadly attacks. Examine the number of Palestinians killed and the number of Israelis killed. I am against any deadly attack on anybody. But you have to mention that the Israeli soldiers, that some of the Israeli soldiers that will be
Mr.
released and
Barghouti,
were released
I appreciate
participated in
your
deadly
comments,
attacks
but these are
on
facts, and it would
Palestinian
be good to get
children.
into the conversation
Yeah,
about where you want peace to
and
come
the fact,
from. So I'm
why
asking
are
you
you not
specifically
giving me the
about,
chance to
because I'm
answer?
asking you specifically a question about Hamas and your expectations around them and what their negotiating position or where they should move. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
You will hear also the fact that 17,000 Palestinian children were killed by Israeli bombardment, and those who participated in that are war criminals, and because they did deadly attacks on the issue of Hamas. Hamas is ready to give up the government in Gaza. Hamas has told all the Palestinian parties that they are ready to accept a national consensus government that could consist of independent people. They are ready to accept that. They were ready also to discuss the issue of the establishment of a Palestinian independent state if the Israeli side is ready. So I don't see a problem here. And I don't think that the issue of Hamas should be used to justify ethnic cleansing of the whole Palestinian people of Gaza Strip or to prevent reaching an agreement of a total and complete ceasefire and an end of this war that could lead eventually to real peace. You have to remember that Israel is the one that is occupying Palestinians, and Palestinians are not occupying Israel. Israel is the one that have subjected us to ethnic cleansing since 76 years, and the longest occupation in modern history that transformed into apartheid, which is not sufficient for them. They want now ethnic cleansing.
And
That is
as you know,
totally unacceptable.
Israel would contest those accusations. When you talk about Hamas
And you would support Israel, yes.
But her worst humiliation came when she interviewed British scholar Dr. H.A. Hellier, as she repeated her lie on Israel ending its Gaza occupation in 2007 once again. Dr. Hellier shut her up brilliantly by stating true facts. But you know what happens when people state facts on the BBC? Samantha thanked him and abruptly ended the interview.
What could a one-state solution, Israeli Jewish people, Palestinians living in one country, what could that actually look like? Are we talking about many decades down the line?
Oh, I'm not advocating it. I'm saying that what we have in practice right now is control of the entire territory from the river to the sea by the state of Israel, but not with equal rights, not with equal civil rights or political rights, which is why you've had numerous human rights organizations, Israeli as well as international ones, describe this as apartheid.
But Israel, as you know, withdrew from Gaza in the early 2000s.
So actually, that's something else that the International Court of Justice addressed in its opinion that was issued last year. And this is the highest authority international law, that the withdrawal of troops from Gaza did not mean the end of the occupation of Gaza. On the contrary, Israel continues to be recognized by the ICJ as the occupying power in Gaza because it maintains effective control. So this whole thing about, oh, it withdrew. No, it didn't withdraw. It simply took its troops out, but it controlled all of the borders. And anyway, I don't want to prolong this, but the state
we must leave it there.
in international law is very clear.
Thank you very much. Do stay with us here on BBC News. We are continue our coverage.
Just see the expression of Dr. Hellier. This will tell you everything about how he felt by the BBC's action. I asked the BBC to explain its side of the story on Samantha Simmonds' perceived pro-Israeli biases. I also told them why UK's 3.9 million Muslims and others who have been truly horrified by Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza in the last 15 months should pay license fee after another non-stop toxic coverage by the BBC. They have chosen not to respond to my tweet. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform and our journalism on buymeacoffee.com and Patreon. If you do think that our journalism is worth supporting, then you too should consider becoming part of it. The details are there in the description of this video. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.